David Forsey with the Aspen Institute. So we've gone over a lot of scary threats today. We've discussed some practices to help mitigate them. But what are some things we're not talking about? What are some things the community should be addressing that we haven't really gotten to yet? So here to delve a little deeper on some of those deeper issues is David Sanger, who will introduce our last but not least panel of the day. Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you all. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times, and glad to be here with the hardy survivors of the day. We have a terrific panel that is designed to try to take us from all that we have heard today to what I consider to be sort of always the hardest question at the end of these kind of conferences, which is, when we're meeting 2 years from now, what is it that we wished we discussed today, right? And I say that because in the cyber world, on the threat side, we have a nearly 100% perfect record, which is to say the big thing that came and whacked us, we almost never saw in advance. And on the solution side, we've got some really good ideas that we've heard, many of which we've heard today, about things that should be done or could be done to improve our security over the next few years. But some of them we wished we had really accelerated long before the worst came. So we want to sort of focus our discussion today on that. Let me start, you've now heard who we've got, Paul Abbate, who's the Associate Deputy Director of the FBI and ran the cyber division, Paul, for a year or so. Is that right?
Yes.
Kelly Bissell, over here, the global lead at Accenture Security. Jeff Kleck was the Director of Cyber for the Defense Innovation Unit, which I still think of as DIUX, but you guys are no longer experimental.
You dropped the X.
You dropped the X. Okay, the experiment is over.
The experiment is over.
That's right. And Candace Worley, who's the Vice President and Chief Technical Strategist at McAfee, and thus protects all of our desktops. So thank you, Candace, for that. Kelly, let me start with you. Tell me what it is when you think out ahead to the threats that you don't think we've discussed enough today that you worry about.
Well, if I look at the history, we've had breaches where they just copy data, and then we move to ransomware. I'm really worried about changing data. I mean, changing the data values in our banking system or in our health records that we're not even sure anymore what's right. So I'm very, very worried about that. And then obviously I'm still worried about SMBs, because it's one thing to solve this problem on the enterprise, but if they go downstream and start attacking small, medium businesses, how are we going to recover from that? So those are the two things I worry about. Hopefully we're watching out for that piece.
Kelly, let me ask you one question on the changing data. So if you think of sort of the 4 big areas of cyber activity that we are concerned about, so you've got plain old surveillance, right, which we've all almost looks boring by now, right?
Yeah.
You've got data manipulation. You have taking over SCADA systems and so forth, which can have an element of data manipulation to them. Right. And then you've got the sort of social influence campaigns. Why is it that, in your mind, we haven't seen more of the data manipulation to date? Because it seems, if you think that Olympic Games, the attack on the Iranian systems was basically a data manipulation game. It was changing the data that fed into how fast centrifuges spun. And that was 10 years ago. Yeah. So you would have thought you would have seen a lot more of that by now.
Well, a couple of things, David. One is I wonder if we haven't noticed. That's one thing. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that is a step up or an escalation where the damage is far greater than just copying the data or surveilling the data. And maybe I would put forth that it's a baby step of escalation, and that's the next step. But I don't think that anybody wants to jump to that part, because that's total escalation, if that makes sense. So I wondered those two things. Maybe we haven't noticed, and maybe that's just the next step of the escalation.
So Candace, we were talking about this a little bit before we came on stage. Of the new technologies that are coming out there, I know it's AI that worries you the most, and data manipulation can be a piece of that. Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about your concern there.
Yeah, so I think there's two elements. You know, artificial intelligence is one of those technologies that will, in many ways, make our lives so much better. If you just think about what organizations are doing with AI and cancer research, for example, we may be able to leverage this technology to cure at least some forms of cancer, if not all cancer. That's incredible. Yeah. But the thing about technology that makes it fascinating and terrifying at times is there's always, you know, its evil twin. And its evil twin is that in the security space, we will likely see adversarial AI, where we use it for good as vendors in the security space, where we leverage it to do better behavioral analysis, look for anomalies, be able to analyze data more quickly and more accurately. But our adversaries may also use it to actually poison the data sets that we're leveraging to train our data models, to actually put additional data into those data sets that biases the data toward an outcome that would make them look like they weren't malicious, that they were actually good. So there are ways that AI, in the context of pure security, will serve us well, but also serve our adversary. And then I think the second part is, we as a global community tend to adopt technology pretty quickly, much more quickly than the ecosystem in which that technology functions adapts. So if we think about pervasive AI and its presence in things like studying genetics, and it's things like autonomous vehicles, in we could call it weapons. I don't know, Wired for War. I read that a couple years ago and didn't sleep for several nights. And you know, you think about those applications. Have we built the legal, economic, social, ethical constructs in the ecosystem around those technologies that we're going to need in order to put guardrails around it? If we think about autonomous vehicles, for example, if we have an autonomous vehicle that's being driven by AI and it interprets a stop sign as a yield sign and ends up hitting someone, where's the liability? Now, we got a little bit of a hint of that with the case in Arizona, but not complete. And we really need to be, I think, more proactively exploring that, because if we don't, I think in 2 years, it's going to be more of a cleanup effort than it's going to be we're building that ecosystem in concert with the technology.
And you mentioned getting into poison the data sets here. One of the striking things about that is you can do that without ever entering the system. In other words, you could have a perfectly protected system if you can get at the data that before it is being fed in.
Yeah, so if you have a system that's being protected by AI-enabled security controls, for example, if you've installed that technology, but somehow the adversary was able to get to the data models downstream from that installation and application, add data to it to bias it in a different direction, or poison that data so that it manipulates it in a way that the product or the solution behaves differently, you're never going to know, because it was there before. So from a security vendor, it's incumbent upon us that we're putting extreme controls in place around our data sets to ensure that data manipulation is mitigated, you know, the risk of that is mitigated to the greatest extent possible.
Right. So Paul, when you look at this from the FBI's perspective and you're trying to, you know, you're overwhelmed by the amount of problems you see out there. They're the cases that come to you. They're the cases that don't get reported to you that you worry about the most, because companies or victims or others don't want to put up with the embarrassment of saying they've been hacked. And then there's what we've just heard from Candace and from Kelly, which is the kind of future threats that you are worried about coming, that you're not sure your workforce has even had much time to think about. So how are we supposed to differentiate among those?
So I would start, David. First, thank you to Aspen Institute for having us here, and thank you, David. 2 areas of focus for us. It's the threat actors, and then the new and newer and emerging technologies, which have already been touched upon in part. We're very focused on the threat actors, obviously. We've got so many coming at us, and it's such a challenging landscape that we all face and are navigating and attempting to counter every day. What we're really concerned about is that it's really a very limited number of players on the nation state side, particularly right now. There's many, many more, obviously, in the criminal side and organized criminal groups, but we're very concerned about the emergence of new players on the field. And when you look at the spectrum from adversary to ally, we've got the big four on this end with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. And then we've got friends over here, and then there's everyone else in between, and there's many others that are aligned over here more toward the adversarial side. And I think we've got to be laser focused on the emergence of new players in the cyber facilitated and enabled arena when it comes to malicious activity. And I would say that we're just starting to see glimmers of that in terms of the work that we do now. We just have to keep the spotlight on that and be prepared to counter that as well. Also, the adaptive behavior on part of the adversary. It's a cat and mouse game that we play in the work that we do in the real world, and it's much the same in the cyber arena. So they're always adapting and learning from the work we do, particularly when it becomes public, and we're doing the same. So it's a race and a partnership each and every day to keep up with that. And then within that space as well, the collaboration and cooperation between those adversaries, I think that's something that we've seen and we have to keep an eye out before, because much like we partner with our allies, they're doing the same on the adversarial side, and they're learning from each other and partnering with each other to come at us here in the United States, and with more sophisticated capabilities and techniques and a sharing amongst each other, and that may apply to emerging players in the arena as well, both on the nation state side and the criminal side. And then I go over to the, call it newer and emerging technologies, AI, IoT, that just increases exponentially the attack surfaces and the platforms that these adversaries can come at us through and are doing so, our citizens, our country, and it's only going to get more challenging as we go forward. And then to wrap it all up, there's the convergence of all of that. There's the nation-state adversaries coming together and new players emerging in the market. There's the criminal groups collaborating with some of those nation-states, as we've seen in cases like the Yahoo breach, where Russia is leveraging ordinary criminal hackers. They're doing traditional crime and fraud and feeding information back to the Russian handlers to serve those purposes. And then we have the seamless integration of the emerging technologies like AI and IoT all coming together, and it just provides more sophisticated platforms and techniques for those adversaries and criminal groups to come at us through.
So Paul, let me press you on one thing I heard you say that I thought was really interesting, which is the difference between states or non-state actors that are collaborating and those who are learning from each other. So after the WannaCry attacks, for example, we saw other states and non-state actors basically exploit versions of the same exploits and vulnerabilities. Saw that with NotPetya as well. Saw that with Stuxnet as well, where there's still pieces of that code that are floating around that people are making use of. But that's looking out across the world and figuring out what's free and easy that I might adopt a tool. Collaboration is a little bit different. That's joining up with somebody and trying to develop something. Are you seeing now, or is what you're saying is that you're seeing now a rise in collaboration, not just adaptation of successful hacks? And what would be some good examples of that?
I see it more as a future threat, David, for sure. I wouldn't say that it's escalated to the level that you just described, but I think it's something that we really need to be sharply focused on and on the lookout for as we go forward. And I think it is reflected in the real world already. We can look out there in terms of what's publicly available and see what countries support each other, prop each other up, attempt to help each other politically, diplomatically, and in other ways. And I think if they're doing that publicly, we could expect that they're doing that in other more nefarious ways as well, and I would expect that that would increase even more so in the future.
I understand you're reluctant to name countries, and I don't blame you, but just to give you a real-life example from proliferation, across many administrations, they said, for example, North Korea and Iran, obviously two big cyber players, have shared missile technology over the past 20 years and taught each other how to build more accurate missiles. Are you suggesting that same kind of state-to-state collaboration is either beginning or may soon begin in the cyber arena?
I think we can expect it, anticipate it, and we need to be on the lookout for exactly what you just described.
Great. Jeff, DIU is supposed to get out and begin to think about long-term issues in cyber that will be adopted to our defense strategies, whether they're on the offense or the defense. And from my past visits to your operation, which is in very cool offices right next to Google, but they seem to have more food out.
They do.
Yeah. And nicer cars in the parking lot, I would point out. You guys have a fairly further out time horizon. You're looking out 5, 10 years at some of these, although there's some technologies you're trying to grab to put in warfighters' hands right away. When you look out at what you've just heard in the terms of the threats, what kind do you guys focus on, knowing that you're looking pretty specifically at things that could be affecting your DoD patrons?
Sure. So, when you talk about, time scale, DIU is under, Defense Innovation Unit is under R&E in the Department of Defense. And under R&E is DARPA, which has a very long vision in terms of time scale. And DIU, which sits on the other side of that spectrum, has a much more compressed time scale. So our focus is at commercially available technology that we can accelerate into the Department of Defense to transform the capability and the capacity of the military and to strengthen the national security innovation base. So that's where we spend our time. And to put some context around that, there are thousands of companies with billions of dollars being invested in them to solve some of these problems that we've discussed. And if you go through, you sift through all those companies, there are some brilliant answers. The issue is more getting your finger on the answers and getting them into operation. And that's where we spend our time and attention. So I agree, these are all issues, everything we've discussed here, they're all problems. Our business is about finding those answers and getting them in place before the adversary has a chance to exploit.
Can you give us an example from the DIU portfolio? I know in some of these you buy, some of them you actually invest in companies and so forth. What's an interesting example or two in cyber where you're trying to get something out in hand pretty fast?
Sure. So we do everything from working with DARPA from the very early end to taking something all the way through. So autonomous cyber reasoning, to detect vulnerabilities and patch those vulnerabilities. There's a great company for All Secure that came out of a DARPA challenge that the DoD is using now. That's a very long burn kind of project, but it is yielding great results for us. Other projects are active cyber deception, autonomous red teaming, autonomous SOCs. You hear the word autonomous a lot. So automating these processes is very important for us. And those are just a few. Yep.
Okay, great. So let me flip this to the other side. So we've talked a little bit about the threats that we may not be focused on now, but we'll wish in 2 years we had. What are some of the solutions you think that we are underestimating right now that we might be able to reach out and go? Candace, you want to?
Yes, I think.
Because I know you guys have to roll these out pretty fast at McAfee.
We do.
Yeah.
And certainly we've been doing a lot of research around the potential for adversarial AI. I don't know if you know Dr. Celeste Freilich. She's one of our chief data scientists, and that's one of her primary areas of focus right now. So really looking at how do we build, security controls around our training sets to ensure that they're, I'm not going to use the word impenetrable because I think anything can be penetrated if someone wants to hard enough, but make it as hard as possible for anybody to get to those data sets. I think the other thing, to the point around autonomous, I think one of the challenges organizations have is a lot of times they actually have the data they need to know that they've been breached. They just haven't looked at it yet, right? In fact, earlier I think there was a comment around the inability to kind of get through everything and identify threats in one of the previous panels. And I think if we can look at ways in which we can automate sifting through data, looking for the clues that would indicate attacks, and make it fast enough that we find that data while it's still fresh, like within an hour, within minutes of that penetration occurring, we can mitigate the damage materially from where we're at right now. The problem is right now, you can't throw enough bodies at, 10 terabytes of data to find the attack in a meaningful amount of time.
Right.
Machines are super effective at sifting through massive amounts of data, finding patterns of behavior, identifying those patterns, and pointing them out as malicious. If we team the machines with the people who can then look at that potentially malicious activity and take action toward remediation, I think we mitigate. I agree with the comment earlier today that we're never going to get to a point where this is going to be a fixed problem. We have an active adversary. They're going to mold and evolve with everything we build, whether it's through the programs that are very, very forward-looking, or the programs like our company or Accenture do. But we have to look at how can we reduce the time frame that they have available to them to do damage once they actually have a small success. And I think there's a focus there that we need to look at.
So, Paul, as I listen to Candace make this point, it reminds me of the rationale you hear from your colleagues at the NSA about the need for what they call persistent presence. Basically, you have to be inside adversary networks, in the NSA's case, outside the United States, see what they are cooking, so that Candace isn't dealing with this with 10 seconds to go make a significant decision when the attack has actually come here. Which gets at a critical question in how the US government shares, not only with Candace and with Kelly and others, but how it shares internally. So if our intelligence community sees an attack brewing, may not know whether it's aimed at the time at a government system or a private system, may not be able to tell until that unleashes. How much better are we now at getting early alert to you? Hey, we see this happening in Russia or in China or in North Korea or in Iran, and you have to be, we're going to try to deal with it before the attack happens, but if we fail, you need to be seeing this coming. Or is that still not happening that much?
I would say that tremendous strides have been made in terms of information and intelligence sharing within the government, among agencies and departments, and also with the private sector. But we're a long way from where we want to be honest, and we've got to continue to work hard at that. As we spoke about earlier, I reflect on our experience in getting better at counterterrorism post 9/11, and we learned hard lessons there with horrendous, devastating attack on our country and loss of life. And we went forward from there over a period of years And we got better within that arena, countering terrorism, at taking the information, sometimes classified and sensitive, and getting it out to appropriate people across government and in the public and private sector as well, to prevent attacks from happening. That was the singular focus, and we made great strides there, and we have I think we're very mature now in that arena when we look at how we do counterterrorism work across the government. It doesn't mean that we stop every attack, but we've come a long way, and we have saved a lot of lives and prevented a lot of attacks from occurring, and that was a long process. I think we're much earlier in that cycle with respect to cyber, which is really a part of everything, including counterterrorism. And we've learned hard lessons there as well, particularly post-2016 elections. And I see that reflected in the 2018 midterms, just in that short period of time, in the way the government came together and with the private sector as well, to really mount a counter-offensive and protect our 2018 midterm elections. And I'm very optimistic and encouraged by what we see there, because we did bring it together quite well across government partners like the NSA and the CAA, DHS, DOJ, FBI, all of us, to share information, I think, much better than we did before, in order to be preventative versus reacting to something bad that happened after it occurred. And then I would further extend that to the private sector. We really bridged that gap with some social media companies in terms of that exchange of information to stay ahead of the threat, with a mutual two-way sharing of information, so that the social media companies were seeing things on their platforms before we were, and advising us of that, which led us out in different directions to discover other things. And then our end, we were seeing things that the companies couldn't. We were sharing information back so that they could take action as appropriate on their platforms and remove and neutralize bad actors. So I'm very encouraged by that, but I still think we have a long way to go and a lot of progress to make, particularly with the rapidly evolving environment and the challenges that we've talked about here, because it really is moving so fast, and there's so many more threats and bad actors coming into the marketplace.
Yeah, Paul, something we were discussing backstage, there is so much instinctive secrecy around cyber, both on defensive and particularly on the offensive side. But the result is that we are using a classification system when you get information about an incoming actor, particularly a state actor, that was designed in the 1950s and 60s for completely different threats. I mean, before there was cyber, before the word was really even known, right? And certainly before the kind of digital technologies we have today. So you've got, 15 and 25 and 35-year classification stamps that come on incoming threats, where the data is probably useful to you for a week or two or maybe a month, right? How do we get around that problem?
I think it goes back in part to kind of what I just talked about. We have the system that we have within government and how we handle information. I don't see that changing anytime soon, but we've got to work most effectively within that, and I think we are. I drew the analogy to what we've accomplished and continue to do in countering terrorism, and we've come a long way there. Cyber is much the same, but even more so, to your point, the movement of information and the actions and adaptability of our adversaries is happening so fast. And I do see a culture change, not just in my organization, but I see it across government as well, and some of the other agencies that I mentioned, and coming together, and a willingness and a drive to take the information down in appropriate ways to the lowest level and share it amongst us, and then more importantly, get it out into the public realm, into the private sector companies, to enable that, to work with them, operational collaboration, which we talked about a lot yesterday and have been focused on, and really step up our game in that regard.
Candace, let me ask you just to reflect for a moment on what we've heard from Paul, because what I hear from your colleagues frequently in the, particularly in the antivirus world and so forth, is that by the time they get that DHS notification that says, be on the lookout for this and that, it's something you had seen weeks or months before. At least that's what you would hear a year or two ago. Are you seeing a difference now? Do you actually see at your end that by the time you get a government notification, it may actually be something you hadn't run across yet?
So I think there are cases where that's still the case. I mean, where we get a piece of feedback and we've seen it. But there are other cases where we're proactively partnering with government organizations to do takedowns, where it is a collaborative effort, where they have information, we have information, we come together and we work to ensure that, whether it's a botnet or whatever, we're eliminating that as a threat at a global level. We have a gentleman in his team, Raj Samani, I don't know if you've encountered him, but he works very extensively with some of the organizations in Europe around, identifying campaigns and working with government, sharing information on specific types of campaigns to help kind of eliminate those before they get widespread. And so I think there's always going to be situations where, you guys know something before we do. We might even at some point know something before you do. The important thing is, I think, one, there's an increase in collaboration, in an active collaboration, not just sharing bits of data back and forth. And maybe that active collaboration can lead to better success in developing a trust model and an operational model where we can accelerate the sharing of the bits of data.
Okay. Jeff, let me ask you, you're the only one of these that have to sort of live in the odd world of Silicon Valley, day to day. I can't imagine why I would say that. And one of the characteristics that you've seen is a hesitance among many companies to go work with and be with the government, and certainly to be highly dependent on their contracts. And you hear this frequently among Silicon Valley startups who say that the two problems of working with the government is, one, they pay their bills really slowly. Most of these companies are, barely holding it together as they're doing it. But secondly, that there is a cultural obstacle. And you saw that in, it was referred to in an earlier session, the resistance among the Google workers to working on Project Maven, which was an AI program basically for drone technology. And in the end, Google decided not to go participate. Now, not every company has got quite the culture that Google has on that. You see different reactions at Microsoft. You see very different reactions at Amazon, for example. But have you encountered that much as you work away on your projects?
No. In fact, I think that story is probably at the end of its life.
Really?
It seems to be cited as an example again and again. It was, it was
pretty high publicity when it happened.
It was, but I have seen none of that. In fact, there are thousands of cyber technology companies, cybersecurity technology companies, and I have not had one instance of an interaction with those ventures, their CEOs, the folks in those companies that weren't interested in what we were trying to do and how we might be able to partner with them.
That's fascinating, because I would not say that your predecessors during the Obama administration would have said the same thing. They cited one case after another to me of companies that were reluctant. At that time, DIU was still DIUX and less well known.
And maybe it's because DIU has been now in the Silicon Valley for some time. We have leadership, Mike Brown, who came right out of
Symantec.
That's right, Symantec, Quantum. So he's one of them. He's one of us. So I think the culture has shifted both in the Department of Defense in terms of working with the Silicon Valley, and I think the culture in the Silicon Valley has shifted in terms of understanding the Department of Defense. And we have gotten much better on how to work from the Department of Defense with the commercial sector. And you know, if you ever need the warm bodies in front of you to sit down and the CEOs of these companies to sit and explain it to you, I could line them up one after another. I think we've done a very good job.
Great. Kelly, as you look at this from Accenture's point of view, what do you see in the cultural shift, if any?
Well, I mean, we not only protect commercial clients like pharma companies and retailers, banks and so forth, but also governments, airports, police stations, DOD, and other sort of functions around the world. You know, most of our security people have a sense of mission. They're here to help protect the company. They're here to help protect the organization. And that sense of mission is high. So not only is that sense of mission high, but this sense of serving that community and the customers, keeping them safe. And so I think that I agree with Jeff. I mean, I think that we have a pretty tight relationship of solving this problem together, not as Accenture by ourselves, but how do we team with FBI? How do we team with McAfee? How do we team with, you know, a whole ecosystem and come together to solve this problem as one?
That also raises a workforce question that I wanted to ask you about, Paul. So you're not only competing with Candace and Kelly for great talent, you're competing with NSA and Cyber Command, you're competing internally in the US government, DHS, and so forth. How do you find that is going? How well have you, 10 years ago, it was hard to find a lot of cyber talent inside the FBI. Today, I hear a lot, you know, I meet and hear from a lot of people who seem pretty impressive and pretty well trained. But I know it's still pretty hard for you to find and retain the talent you want to hold on to.
I would say that it goes to something Kelly just said, the mission. That's what we've got. You know, protecting the country, keeping people safe. There's no greater sense of duty and fulfillment than one can get from that. And that's something that inherently draws exceptional individuals to the FBI across the organization, and that is inclusive of our cyber program as well, both in the field and at headquarters. It is, having said that, as you pointed out, it's a highly competitive marketplace, and we're all in competition with each other for the very best and brightest who have those particular skills. But we're doing very well in that regard. Our overall attrition rate for any category or role of employee in the Bureau is historically and currently extremely low. It's under, for special agents, it's about 0.5% per year. And I would say that, I would assert that that's unrivaled across just about any, you know, in government and in the commercial sector.
Is that true also among your cyber specialists? Because they're the one, I mean, all the special agents could go out and make more money elsewhere, but your cyber special agents can really go out and make more money elsewhere.
So that is something that we wrestle with, and it is, the attrition rate is slightly elevated with respect to those who have gained skills and work within the cyber program, but it's still extraordinarily low, and it's fluctuated since we've started gauging that in recent years, probably anywhere between 1%, maybe up to 3% on the high end. But we want it to be as low as possible, and we want to retain all of the individuals with those skills, but it's still really, really low. And we're investing heavily in going out and working hard, in addition to capturing people on the mission, but working hard to bring them to the organization, allowing people on the outside to get to know us, whether it's from industry or straight out of school, kind of expanding approaches that we're taking to that. We have a very robust intern program that we've implemented over the past few years. We had 1,200 plus interns that we brought on board from colleges and universities this past year. And many of them go on to be full-time employees, and many of them have the type of skills that we're talking about here. And we've even implemented programs going down to the high school level where we're partnering with STEM-focused high schools to get to know people even earlier on in their educational cycle so that they could come into the Bureau hopefully later on.
And is Scholarship for Service something you're leveraging, the Scholarship for Service program, where I think it's through it's through DHS, and they're funding, basically they'll help pay for tuition for a student to go to school for a couple of years, and then the student commits to working for the federal government for another 2 years. So you literally have students who are going through cybersecurity programs, and then the government helps to pay for their tuition for a couple of years, and then they commit 2 years in a cybersecurity function for a government agency. And I testified on this a while back. 70% of those people stay.
Yes.
So like there are some programs that are being put in place by the government where they're getting proactive about how can we if we can get people to come in and get that sense of mission, we can retain them. And those programs are helping to drive that.
Yeah, I wonder if I could disagree. I don't think we're competing, even though we've got former Bureau people. I don't think we compete at all. I actually think it's just another chapter in that person's career, whether they come from industry into the Bureau or from the Bureau into industry. Because at the end of the day, we're here together. You just maybe a running back and I happen to be a wide receiver, so I just think that we're in the game together on one team.
Yeah,
I don't think we compete at all.
I very much agree with Kelly. When I said I think we're doing well, that was the collective we of government and the commercial sector. I think something that the adversary has really helped is galvanize the interest of those focused at this, to figure out how do we work better together to solve the issues. And that's what I was trying to get at in terms of I think we're doing well. We've got a lot of things to do, but the interaction's great. The folks that we get a lot of folks out of the reserve that are from companies that you mentioned. They're spending time with us and time back in those companies, and sharing between the two. I think it's been very effective. A lot of attention to it.
Just to leverage off of that point, I think you're right. One of the things we're looking at in the Bureau is ways to do things differently than we have in the past in terms of hiring and retaining people. And traditionally in the FBI, we've had individuals come on board and they generally stay for they do the whole career. It's reflected in the attrition rates. We're thinking about ways now within the system of hiring that we have that we can better enable and facilitate people in and out of the organization, much like occurs in the private sector. And we're trying to adapt to that. It's challenging because we have background investigations that take a long time and security clearances that need to be issued. But we are encouraging people more so to seek opportunities in the private sector so that they can go out, gain experience there, and get even better, and then give them pathways to come back into the FBI. And I think I see that as a sort of wave of the future that we can leverage.
Yeah, maybe two things. Secondments, bidirectional secondments. And, whenever if I lose someone to the Bureau, awesome. I'm actually happy about that because I have a contact, a relationship still, and it broadens our network. Or the other way around, like with Howard and others, because they're gonna maintain that relationship. So that is really important. I think it's a healthy thing to sort of go back and forth.
It will likely help to accelerate trust.
Totally, yeah.
Jeff, I'm reminded of a great moment I discovered visiting DIU a number of years ago. It was during the Obama administration when a number of defense officials were first coming out to the Valley, and they were trying to come up with a program in which you could take people out of the companies and put them inside the Pentagon for a year or two. And one of the company heads said to these very senior defense officials, I don't think my employees are going to pass your your security clearance. And the senior official said, you mean because they smoked pot when they were in college? And he said, no, because they smoke pot while they code. He said, yeah, that could be a problem. You know? So, but it is a bit of a cultural change. We've just got a couple minutes here. If there's any urgent question you have for anybody in here, if not, I've got one more for everybody else. I see a hand out here. Any takers? If not, I've got one for you about the cloud. We're now about to see the Pentagon, if they ever finally issue this or move to cloud computing. And there was a lot of resistance inside the Pentagon about whether concentrating their data in the cloud, while they understood the interactivity of this, made the security harder or easier. There now seems to be a consensus that it will make it easier. And I'm wondering what you've learned along the way as the Pentagon has sort of grappled with cloud technology here. And Paul, I'd be interested in hear the same thing for the FBI.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak for the entire Pentagon,
Sure.
all the services, combatant commands, agencies.
All of whom have different views, I'm sure, yeah.
You know, and that's great.
Yeah.
That's very healthy, right, for an organization to have all those perspectives. But the cloud definitely has its value, and you know the Department of Defense appreciates that, and it will have its place. And you, like you said, you can see it coming. We just have, when we do something, there are a lot of questions to ask. You know, there are a lot of reasons to ask those questions too. You know, it's the security of the nation that's at stake. So I think having a methodical approach to the technologies and knowing how you're going to defend the technologies is the right way to go.
And Paul, the CIA's had a pretty successful cloud transition. I mean, when you ask people around government, what's your best example out here of something that's both sharing data and improving this, they usually send you to the CIA experience. What's the FBI experience been?
I would say the same. We're taking a very methodical approach to that transition, and I think ultimately we see it as a hybrid. We have historically we've stored all of our data and our holdings, internally. We've held it very tightly on closed systems, but we have leveraging the experience of our partners in the CIA and other agencies and learning from that. We have started to migrate some of our data and functions to the cloud, and we've had good experience in that early on. One area would be, though it's not operational in nature, is human resources. So some of the administrative side stuff to sort of test the waters. But we do envision a future where we'll move operational data into the cloud as well, so that we can apply more sophisticated tools to it and better leverage it as well. So methodical hybrid approach for the future, but we're moving in that direction also.
Well, I want to thank you all. We have not concluded all of our questions, but we have concluded all of our time. And I want to thank everybody here for sticking with what's been a really fascinating day. So thank all of you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.